Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Capola, and I am joined here today by Evan Buck and our newest, official team member, Ty. You guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves real quick?
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
Hey, it's Kai coming back for another episode. Very excited to delve into our topic today.
And Evan, what is our topic today?
Yes, so cutting right to the chase, we have ourselves a very interesting fork that I'll call a co-creation of Kai and I. Really, it's kind of Kai's brainchild, but I also kind of co-signed onto it as well. So I'll say it's like 80% his idea, 20% my, submitting some ideas to it as well. But basically, we're going to go back to an interesting year in world history, 1989. And during this year, there were a couple of major events that happened. And for those of us in the audience who are astute historians, you probably remember that year as the year that the Berlin Wall fell. But that is not the only thing that fell during 1989. In our timeline, we have in a different continent, a different hemisphere, in South Africa, we have the falling of their nuclear program. And it might come as a surprise to a few people here listening that South Africa even had a nuclear program to begin with. It's not something that's necessarily super well known about, but they in fact did. And the apartheid era government in South Africa, they took a couple of cues from another nuclear armed nation, Israel, and there's a lot of substantial suspicions and speculation that Israel was involved in South Africa's covert nuclear weapons program. They kind of copied some of their homework a little bit, and for a while, the South Africans also maintained this plausible deniability towards the nuclear program, this purposeful ambiguity on their part, saying, well, we might have them, we might not have them. But it did eventually come to light that they did, in fact, develop 6 nuclear weapons and were in the process of developing a 7th by the time that they ended up shutting down their program. The main reason that they did this was primarily as a defensive insurance policy. During the Cold War, there were a lot of proxy conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets and the Cubans in particular saw a lot of fertile ground for Marxist ideology and thoughts in certain sub-Saharan African and Southern African governments. So in Angola and in Zimbabwe, some other countries in the region, there were some Marxist rebellions that were fomenting and being supported by the Soviet Union. And so South Africa took a look at this, and they're in an interesting, rather precarious position. On the one hand, they are supported somewhat by the West because they're not a communist government. They're ran by, the minority white government, and they kind of by and large, they function like a Commonwealth country does today. Commonwealth of Independent States, not Commonwealth of Independent States, but the Commonwealth of Great Britain, all these former countries that used to be a part of Britain, they function as a generally pro-Western government. So into their interests, anti-Soviet interests, anti-communist interests. So the Soviets don't really like them that well. But on the other hand, the Western governments don't really like South Africa's blatantly racist apartheid policies. So in a certain sense, the South Africans were kind of left high and dry. They were rather an international pariah at the moment that they decided, you know what, more likely than not, no one is going to come to our defense. Nobody is really going to defend our interests if something happens to us. So if we develop these nuclear weapons, we have a stronger basis. We can project this soft power and basically have the increased Soviet presence, the increased Soviet operations in the region, not really want to mess around with them as much. So because of the circumstances, they're surrounded by a number of unstable countries with dictatorships or rebellions, communist uprisings. They basically saw these nukes as a useful deterrent for any faction that might want to, bring this conflict, bring this instability into South Africa.
So just a clarification. South Africa's exporting some instability around now.
Indeed.
This isn't a one-way street. South Africa is basically, as a reminder that there were colonial empires other than the British and French. I think this episode is a great reminder of it because you have Dutch settlers and Portuguese colonies. It wasn't just those two.
And
German Southwest Africa, which is Namibia, that South Africa owns at this point in history.
Without getting too in the weeds, too in the bush on this one. Yeah, you guys know what I did there.
I see what you did.
Bushmen.
Yeah. So basically, like, Portugal decolonizes in 1975. 1975 is when Portugal gives up its colonies. Gerald Ford was president. We have listeners that were alive when there were still European colonial empires in Africa. And this, when this happens, you have a multi-way civil war in Angola. And basically, after Vietnam, the United States is a little gun shy.
They're a little gun shy. Yeah.
Getting involved in another country. So they use South Africa and they flood South Africa with a lot of weapons and a lot of supplies with the understanding that these are going to be turned around and used to do what we want, to try and keep the Marxist MPLA Soviet Cuban-backed forces from taking over Angola. And there's a 15-year war between Angola, Namibia, which, as I believe it was Kai said, is a semi-colony, is owned by South Africa. It's just, the world doesn't recognize it, but South Africa owns it. And it's almost as if there's fighting on both sides of this border. There's people in Angola trying to drive the South Africans out of Namibia. There's people, the South African government in Namibia and everywhere else trying to drive the Angolan government out. It's just all over the place there.
Yeah. And Namibia, Southwest Africa, under the German colonial name, it was actually a part of the South African government's apartheid plans of basically having these whole kind of separate colonies for the Black Africans. That's a whole nother sideshow rabbit hole that we won't delve into on this episode. But be that as it may, so in our timeline, by the year 1989, the Soviet Union was not really as able to project its power on the international stage anymore. They're, in rapid decline. Leading to them, of course, dissolving in 1991. And they're not able to support these regional factional groups as much. And Cuba has also kind of withdrawn by this point a lot of its operations, a lot of its support. So in our timeline, we have the apartheid government choosing to disarm and to give up its nuclear weapons. And there is heavy suspicion, there's heavy speculation that a big reason why they did this was because they knew that the African National Congress, or the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, would be taking over within a short period of time. And they end up in our timeline taking over in 1994. So F.W. de Klerk and the apartheid government takes a look and says, hey, we don't really want these super powerful nuclear weapons, which are still being, plausibly denied. Nobody formally knows whether or not they actually exist. There's heavy suspicion that they do. But the South African government knows they exist, and they say to themselves, we don't really want these falling into the hands of a Black African government, so we're just going to disarm. Now, in 2017, FW de Klerk, in an interview with the New York Times, vociferously denied this, saying that wasn't really part of our calculus. We can take his word for it, but I find it hard to believe that wasn't at least part of the apartheid era government's calculus here. So let's not really kid ourselves. So in our timeline, South Africa disarms in 1989, and they end up becoming the first country in the world to have had nuclear weapons, completely disarmed them, and then gone on to sign the landmark treaty on nonproliferation, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2019. And then they also ended up signing the 1991 treaty on nonproliferation as well. So in our timeline, we're going to be turning this on its head. We are going to see what would have happened if South Africa decided to retain its nuclear arsenal past 1989. So with all of that background set up, let's talk about like the first immediate impacts, because like I made mention, we have ANC, Nelson Mandela, gaining more influence, more power, and the apartheid government knowing that their time is up. It's going to be up very soon. And whatever the motivation would be for them in the alternate timeline for deciding to keep these weapons, I don't think we necessarily need to get into super deeply here, but we are essentially going to be saying that, hey, it's totally fine that these nuclear weapons get into the hands of what at this point is known as a neo-Marxist, revolutionary, dare I say, violent organization that wants to lead the country. Kai, I think in the pre-podcast you had some very good points about who the ANC is, who Nelson Mandela is, because in 2025 we tend to think of him in a certain light. We think of him in a certain way, but in the 1980s and 90s, was he necessarily seen in that same light, Kai?
No, in fact, Nelson Mandela's image has been greatly rehabilitated by distance from his actual work. Nelson Mandela was not. So one thing that we talked about in the pre-podcast, and this is not a term that we coined, is that Nelson Mandela has been in some senses Gandhi washed, right? Mahatma Gandhi, the peaceful person who was against colonialism, British colonialism in India, and used peaceful means to help gain independence for India. Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi are very different people, both in terms of their personnel lives and as well in terms of their methods and their modes of action. Nelson Mandela was not a warrior for peace. He was a warrior who was trying to fight with military aggression against apartheid. And he was willing to use force, and he did use force, and he advocated for the use of force. And he was arrested and imprisoned for 27 years for doing what we would today very likely have called terrorism, right? He would have been categorized as a terrorist. His goal was noble, to destroy apartheid and to bring down the apartheid state, but he did not use peaceful means to do that, nor did he advocate for that. However, when he became president, he was very much an advocate for peace. But I think that what's relevant here and what we should discuss as well is, does the disarming of South Africa alter the ability of the ANC to come to power in 1994? And I think that we discussed this in the pre-podcast, but just to establish this, we think the answer to that is no. The disarmament was a response to an already crumbling regime. It was not the cause of the crumbling of the regime. So if in the alternate timeline, South Africa does not disarm, it does not affect the ANC's rise to power. It simply changes the circumstances in which they rise to power. I think that's an important thing to set up kind of as a foundation for our forthcoming speculation.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And I do think that it's important to remind the listeners that this, South Africa took the Israeli approach on their nuclear weapons and officially was like, yeah, who knows if we have these or not. Because like when I was doing my research and looking back on this, and even in my document that I wrote on this subject, one can see that I didn't really know that. So I kind of assumed that most of the world knew this to be the case. And let's be real, like the CIA, most governments who are in the know, and also, if you are officially denying, the possibility of whether or not you have nukes, or basically like being ambiguous about it, it's kind of like when you ask somebody, and you're like, are you asking for a friend or are you asking for yourself? Like it's very obvious that, well, you're asking for yourself. Or if you have to say, well, maybe, the answer is probably yes. So most people probably know that they have nuclear weapons at this point. And we have Mandela and the ANC take over in 1994. Personally, something that I think might happen as an immediate consequence with the nuclear weapons program still going on. Because let's also keep in mind, the ANC officially had a stance. I don't know if it's like totally against nuclear weapons, but I definitely think that they were not, they didn't want proliferation that much, or that's for sure. Like I knew they were against
Nobody wants
proliferation.
proliferation once you have them.
Yeah, right. But
once
here's
you're in
something.
the club, you don't want any more members.
Yeah, right.
Proliferation for me, but not for thee.
Yeah, right. And so, but I mean, there's a difference between, complete disarmament position, like pacifist position, and, well, let's just keep what we have on hand. I think that because of the ANC's positions on the issue, and Mandela coming into power seeking reconciliation and peace once he is in office, I think one of the first things that goes is the policy of nuclear ambiguity. I think we know, and I think he says what we have in the storehouse as a way for him to gain international credibility, and kind of a little bit trying to establish a bully pulpit for himself. I think that's one of the first things that happens. Chris, do you want to opine on that?
Sure. And chips. He admits he has them so that I think one of the key, looking back on Mandela, yeah, he started out as a violent guerrilla. I think he was in charge of one of the more successful regime transitions. And I think that leads to some of the Gandhi wash we think about. I think he probably would have come in and said, listen, we have these things. Almost like we want to get rid of them, but we're not going to give them away. So we admit we have them. What will you give me to take these off my hands? I guess is the best way to think about that. Because one of, I think in the pre-show, Kai was very, very clear and discussing with us, like, the United States and the West is not going to be comfortable with a ANC having these weapons. Is that fair to say?
Right. What I was saying is that, so Nelson Mandela, he wins the presidential election and then he rises to power in 1994. And he is, I think it's fair to say, embraced by the West, at least embraced by the United States. Bill Clinton and Nelson Mandela, as Evan pointed out, had a great personal relationship as well as a diplomatic relationship. And, but we have to remember the auspices in which this takes place, right? This is happening. All of this is happening with a South Africa that is disarmed. One has to wonder, if South Africa is not disarmed, does Bill Clinton, does the U.S. administration look at this situation and think to themselves, well, hold on. We have a South African revolutionary, right, who is just elected president, and he's coming to power having, engaged in violent insurrection. And this man now has his finger on the nuclear button. Do we see a more tepid embrace of Nelson Mandela, or do we see outright attempts to subvert Nelson Mandela because they're afraid of proliferation. They're afraid of a quote unquote insurrectionist having his finger on the nuclear button. How does the US and the West respond to a nuclear armed Mandela?
I think there's a lot
Any
of
thoughts?
pressure. I think there's a lot of pressure applied. Basically, and this is how I see it. Like, the insurrectionist Mandela is of course different than the President Mandela. And I think that, the Soviets have already fallen. Angola's in its civil war. I think it might be in an interlude in the Angolan Civil War at this point. But America and Bill Clinton, like in his campaign, he a big part of what ended up happening after the Soviet fall is Clinton was like, okay, our big enemy is gone. The communism has been defeated. We're chill. We're good. So we don't really have to do that much. And I talked about this in a prior episode where we talked about the differences between like the Marshall Plan after World War II and then what happened with the Soviet Union collapse and the power vacuum as a result, largely being because the United States didn't really want to involve ourselves too much, like terribly in foreign adventurism. We do have Bosnia going on at this point with NATO, starting in 1992. So I think with, the tact I think that the United States is probably going to take is, look, guys, we've given you a ton of weapons. Now, you meaning South Africa geographically. Obviously, we were giving them to the white, neo-colonialist apartheid government to protect our interests. But you guys still have a ton of those weapons. Now you guys have formally acknowledged nuclear weapons. So we're willing to work with you. We don't want more conflict. We don't want more war. And, this is a rather unstable part of the world. So we want you guys to be our friends. We want you guys, even though like you're kind of a little bit more left of center than we would like, maybe a little bit of those more Marxist undertones that we don't really like as much. We don't want to be your enemies. Why can't we be friends? I think that's going to be the American government's attitude. So
I think I think what happens is they come in heavy. They come in very aggressively. They come in very kind of putting the screws to them, and then they realize they're pushing against an open door. The fact is that the reason South Africa had these weapons has now disappeared. The regime in Pretoria is not intrinsically opposed to the political independence of all of its neighbors. So it's not afraid the way the apartheid regime was. So the United States, I think Kai had a really good point about the tone the United States is going to take. I could see them sounding a little almost like Saddam, coming in and saying, you cannot have these weapons. And South Africa throwing up their hands and saying, you're right. We don't want them. Please help us get rid of them. And I think the tone of the United States will change once they see, I guess, the other Mandela or that this regime is willing to play ball on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Mandela wants to be taken seriously on the global stage, but he very much realizes that there is little rationale existing to keep the nuclear program and the nuclear weapons existing in keeping them around. They're kind of more of a problem for him than they are really helping him at this point. Let's not forget the fact that these things cost millions upon millions of dollars just to keep them up per year. For a government that's really trying to get its sea legs and has a lot of economic changes, progressive policies that it wants to enact on its plate, those sorts of programs need one thing and a lot of it, and that's money to grease the gears. So Chris and Kai, I think, both make very good points that the South African government under the ANC, under Mandela, who are already ideologically not really wanting these weapons to begin with, are going to say, yeah, let's get rid of them and let's have the United States help us with that. So this is where we're going to end the episode, right? Because we just kicked the can down the road by 5 years. We end up disarming South Africa under the ANC and Mandela. and we just snap right back to our timeline, right?
Yeah. By the way, I do kind of okay. Geez, this is one of our more recent topics, I think. By the way, but also going on at exactly this time is we've mentioned Soviet disarmament or the Soviet dissolution and the idea of um the Soviet Union dissolving itself. One of the other things that happens as a part of that is the Soviet nuclear weapons are basically given to Russia. Ukraine, as a Soviet nation, it's imagine if the United States were to dissolve, North Dakota would still have nuclear weapons because of the missile bases there. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine was holding some Soviet weapons, and they didn't want to give them up for free. That's kind of what we're saying with South Africa here. Yeah, we have them. Yeah, we want to give them up, but we don't want to give them away for free. There was a suggestion that Ukraine got certain promises that don't look that worthwhile, given we're literally okay, guys.
The current state of affairs. Let's not get too deep into it.
Let's date the episode. Yeah.
Yes, let's very much date the episode. Trump met Putin yesterday in Alaska. But the idea, the promise or the supposition was the West promised to guarantee Ukraine's borders if they would hand the weapons that wound up in Ukraine during the dissolution over to Russia. I say all of that to say nobody gives up these things for free.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we keep the episode going.
Exactly. Because what I was going to say, whenever I like to say that line of, okay, nothing has changed, we can all go home now, I always direct our listeners to look to the episode length and realize that this is not, in fact, where we ended things. So we have a very interesting suggestion. And I think this lines up incredibly well with Bill Clinton's, personal philosophy and way that he liked to negotiate and run things. And also in terms of the timeline itself, because there's a very interesting bill that passed and went into effect right at the start of this year in question in 1994. And this is a bill that has had a lot of debate about it, about its impacts, about its effects. We're not going to get into that, of course, but just the fact that NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, took effect January 1st of 1994. So we already have this precedent of, an American government, an American president wanting to open up free trade, kind of this continuation of the Nixon opening up China philosophy, where if we open up free trade absolutists, maximists, that will cause more and more governments to become more democratic and to like us more. Has that actually panned out? In a lot of ways, it probably hasn't. China isn't exactly a beacon of liberty and freedom. We don't know it as that. They're still very much a communist state capitalist sort of government. But we think that the South Africans will say, all right, give us something nice. And we'll let you oversee, if not actually have you come in and disarm the nukes yourself. So,
well, the United States has a couple thousand. We can always use 6 more.
And we can just take them, because that is what America likes to do as well, is extract whatever resources we can. So in the end, whatever happens to the nukes, whether we take them, disarm them, whatever, we think that it is very possible that instead of on top of a North American Free Trade Agreement, we would have maybe a SAFTA, a South African Free Trade Agreement that would, really deepen the trading relationship, economic interdependence between our two nations. And Chris had a really interesting, like, kind of downstream effect of this that I would love for him to delve into.
So one of the, there's a lot of stuff going on right around now. And I think one of the things that the entire world is dealing with in the mid 90s is it used to be that when two countries had a conflict, one would pick the Soviet Union, one would pick the United States, and they would just flood it with supplies, weapons, and that's how it got settled. During the dissolution, I'll say the dissolution of the Cold War, nobody really knows how to solve an international issue anymore.
We can't just flood with weapons. We can't just pit one side against the other. We can't make it a proxy conflict.
By the way, I think it's not, if you look at a lot of the flooding that the United States did, it's not because we wanted to. It's because we were scared the Soviets were flooding the other side.
Yeah.
So what you run into is things like what happened in Yugoslavia when it dissolved and fell apart into civil strife. The United States and Western Europe and NATO aren't sure. It's almost like they have spent so long just waiting to see what the Soviets do to counter that. They don't really feel comfortable carrying out their own national interest or their own. They can't justify doing something because the Soviets aren't involved there. There's no more Soviets to be involved there. Why? What do we want to do with our power? Eventually they decide to do something there, but you have like Nagorno-Karabakh. I know I slaughtered that name. The Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan. We don't know what to do there. We have, and it's this really interesting period of instability. And one of the ways to solve instability is to have a country wanting to fill a power vacuum. And one of the thoughts we talked about was South Africa, now that it, again, isn't like definitionally opposed to the existence of its neighboring power structures, South Africa stepping up and wanting, and nowadays we know South Africa as a member of the BRICS. I think them trying to assert a regional sphere of influence, one of the things that they could have requested, one of the deals they would have made for their weapons with the United States, with Western Europe, support economics and kind of almost a Nixon doctrine of, that is South Africa's area. They can do things in that area. And getting to 94, that is the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. And I think one of the real, I think if the Rwandan genocide would have happened in 1984, one side would have been supported by the Soviet Union. The United States would have gotten involved in the other side, and they would have maybe just two forces confronting each other versus a complete vacuum where the world is seeing something bad happening, but nobody is stepping up to do anything about it. I think an empowered South Africa, not in an assertion of its power, but in a gathering of the regional, whatever limited regional projection forces there are, to step in and try and stop the genocide in Rwanda. Kai, do you have?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting proposition. So we have a South African government that abandons their nuclear weapons in exchange for greater economic trade and investment from the United States. This in turn leads to an expanded South African economy and a South Africa that can act as a sort of regional hegemon that can then intervene in regional conflicts like the Rwandan genocide. I think that's a really interesting proposition in part because, as Chris notes, the Rwandan genocide did not have the USSR, USA bifurcation that previous conflicts did. So there wasn't outside intervention in the same way. And this allowed that conflict to become a genocide. It's interesting as well because Evan in the pre-podcast noted that the United States has a tendency to be very willing to write checks, but not so willing to put boots on the ground. And what Rwanda needed more than anything else was boots on the ground. It did not need checks, right? There was really, I mean, the Tutsis were, to my understanding, the Tutsis were really the administrators of the country. But it was the Hutus who committed the genocide in large part. And it was more complicated than that, of course, but there wasn't really much of a government to give money to. If we have an enabled South Africa, a South Africa that is economically prosperous because of close economic ties from SAFTA, does the US write a check to South Africa basically saying, this is your check to go and deal with the situation that's taking place in Rwanda? And do we see a truncated Rwandan genocide or no Rwandan genocide at all?
I think it's truncated, and I think that South Africa is going to be able to project its power to the point where they can say, hey guys, come to the table. We have a open, office building here for you guys to come in here, hash out your differences, come to Pretoria, we'll handle it. And if you guys don't leave the building with an agreement, we are more than happy to take the cash that we've gotten from America to establish order. I think that's how they do this. And something else that I also thought about as well is that, because Chris, you mentioned the idea of BRICS, and BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then it originally was just BRIC, and then South Africa was thrown into that eventually. But what BRICS basically is this effort by a lot of different nations who saw what happened post the Soviet collapse, and they saw the United States rising as the world's preeminent superpower, really the only major superpower. These countries took a look at that and said, I don't know if we like that as much. I think that things are better when there's a multipolar world and there's more than just America exporting its hegemony, its power abroad. So BRICS was founded largely as an economic group trying to establish a degree of independence politically and economically from the United States. But in this timeline, we have a South Africa that is much more closely tied to the United States and much more, I would say, grateful to the United States. So do we have them not really being as much of this non-aligned movement kind of country that we see them as now? And this is also something I posited in my notes as well. Do we have much more of a blunting of the power and force of China in the African continent, and specifically in the sub-Saharan African region? Because, in our timeline, we in the United States, the American government basically has not done very much at all in the region. We might have some bases in, Eritrea and, Ethiopia and, have some working relationships with a lot of the governments there. But after Somalia, we're just kind of like, yeah, you know what? That doesn't matter as much to us anymore. We don't want to get too involved in all of that. We got bigger fish to fry. So this has kind of left given the ability for the Chinese Communist Party to come in and say, hey guys, America's not helping you. We'll build that hydroelectric dam that has been stalled for tons of years because of bureaucracy and lack of funding. We'll build that football stadium for you. We'll build all these things for you. And so as a result, we see a lot of these countries either becoming non-aligned or becoming much closer to China in our timeline. I am really interested to see the downstream effects of what a more closely tied to the United States, South Africa is going to bring with China's economic influence and force being significantly blunted. I think that's really interesting to think about that. And Chris, you had you had brought up something in the pre-podcast that I think this is the perfect time to bring it up, and it has something to do with a possible South African or Bantu union in the form of like the European Union. Take it away from here on that.
I think one of the things that South Africa aims to do is to create and I call it Bantu Union. The reason is, if you picture like the part of it, if you picture Africa, you have the kind of West African hump. If you draw a line from kind of Cameroon across to Kenya, everything south of that is basically considered a Bantu language family. They were an ethnic group that settled below, a bigger group. Not to get too into it, I think that presents a really interesting opportunity for South Africa to create a free trade raw material area. And thinking of the BRICS, it's interesting, the composition of the BRICS, and to think about the like initial non-aligned movement of the 50s. They were very, long story short, it was a way for it was very heavily communist, I would say, that non-aligned movement. I think what you would see is not a South Africa married to the United States, but maybe a South Africa similar to India, in that it's playing both sides. And it's not tied to the US, but it's creating an economic trading bloc that has a lot of important materials that, with the electronics revolution, really make it really make it something you want on your side. They realize that, and I find it interesting you mentioned hydroelectric dams, because I'm going back to what happened with the Aswan High Dam in Egypt, which was, hey, United States and Great Britain, you don't want to fund this, the Soviets will. And the ability to play those two sides off against each other, I think, really opens some opportunities to make Africa, for the lack of a better phrase, matter in geopolitics in a way that keeping it split up into smaller states maybe doesn't.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fascinating possibility. And I like that you brought up the idea of like the rare earth minerals and everything, because let's take, for example, like the Congo and Democratic Republic of the Congo, a region that has been historically just racked with instability, and it's very resource mineral rich, but because of the conflict, because of, lack of a really good central government, there's a lot of riches there that are either not extracted, or they are extracted and then just given to corrupt actors or whatever. You have a South Africa that basically does what it does in Rwanda, and they go and they say, are you guys fighting again? Really, guys, this has been like the third time this month. Come on, get your stuff together. You got a lot of really valuable minerals that if you guys stopped fighting, maybe your lives would be a lot better. And maybe, our whole region would be more powerful on the world stage if we actually just got everything together and worked together as a group. Let's hash this out. Let's get a deal going. So I think you have China, you have the United States, you have all of these countries in the world paying way more attention now to an area of the world that has basically, almost up until the modern day, has not really been given a big seat at the table in terms of international affairs. Chris did posit, and he did hint at this possibility of, South Africa maybe being given a seat on the United Nations Security Council. I don't think it's going to necessarily reach to that degree or that level. But I do, and when I say a seat on the Security Council, I'm talking about, we have the 5 permanent members, US, Great Britain, France, Russia, China. And what's interesting about BRICS as well is that with the exception of Brazil, all of the participants in BRICS are either nuclear states or had nukes in the case of South Africa. With Brazil, what's interesting about Brazil, as I also, researched during the pre-podcast, is Brazil had a covert nuclear weapons program as well. It didn't end up actually making any nukes under the military dictatorship regime. And then once the democratic government came in, they did away with that. But they still kept a lot of their nuclear capabilities. And they're basically able to start off a weapons program at any point with the knowledge that they have on hand. So I think as we move forward in the alternate timeline, having a more powerful South Africa that has all the benefits of what it gains in the canonical timeline, our timeline, of being seen as this poster child of disarmament, and being seen as this country that had nukes, gave them up, and now is really leading on the world stage. But they also still have this little silver lining. They still have this little cloud like Brazil has, which is, hey, if things really go bad, if things really hit the fan, we can just go to the back of the book and kick things off again if things got really bad.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we are kind of implying, but maybe it deserves to be stated, is that the we'll call it we'll call it the moral imperative, the moral initiative, the moral credit that South Africa will get is something that shouldn't be balked at, right? In the canonical timeline, in our timeline, South Africa disarms on the premise that, or at least in part, because they're worried about the African National Congress coming to power and having nuclear weapons. So they do it as a response to a very specific emerging quote unquote crisis. And so it's not really a morally backed decision. If Mandela makes the decision of, hey, apartheid's gone, relative peace is being enjoyed now, nevertheless, on moral grounds, we are going to disarm. That gives them something that, frankly, no other country has. And it also might set a precedent for further disarming of other countries, because now we have a country that is disarming not to avert some crisis, but instead on moral grounds. I think that presents an interesting scenario. It gives South Africa this badge of honor, which they still try to wear it today. They still, tout themselves as the first country that voluntarily disarmed. But anybody who knows the history knows that the voluntary disarming is done under some strange circumstances, and it's not really a moral decision. It's more of like a pros versus cons list thing.
To put this in a little more of a realpolitik perspective.
Yeah.
The apartheid regime in South Africa does get credit for disarming. It's just they had so many negatives on their ledger book. Yeah. While if you're coming in as the ANC, you don't have those negatives. So you are having a much greater net gain because of that good thing you did.
It's basically like, I remember in this cartoon, I forget what cartoon it was, but it was basically like a paper thin book entitled A List of Adolf Hitler's Good Ideas. That's basically what in our timeline this became, is it becomes part of the paper thin book of the apartheid government's good ideas. In this alternate timeline, we now have this as being something that was a major credit, a major badge of honor for a group of people, a government that is by and large seen as a good government, the anti-apartheid government. So that's really interesting. And I think as we kind of start maybe circling the drain a little bit here, drawing the episode to somewhat of a close, I did want to throw out one other issue, which might spawn a whole host of other issues. And that is something that I thought about before the podcast as well, but in a different way, because I thought we were going to take this episode a little bit of a different direction, is what happens to proliferation as a whole with other nations that are nuclear aspirants. They want nuclear weapons and they're going after them. And also, Chris, I'm going to say here as well as a little bookmark as well. I would love for you to share the story about the Operation Yellow Cake or whatever it was, and with Iraq and everything. I want you to share that too. But we'll get there in a minute. But let's for a second, let's think of it as, the South African government in late 80s, they're still apartheid. They're an international pariah. They choose to give up the weapons. They retain those weapons in this alternate timeline. And the corollary that I made in my notes is some of the rationale for why North Korea wants weapons is North Korea is seen as an international pariah. They can't really count on much of anybody besides Russia and China to defend them. And honestly, at various points in North Korea's history, even they kind of tick off, Russia and China at certain points. So North Korea is like, hey, we want these nukes. We're still technically in a state of war with South Korea, and we'd love to take them over someday. So we want these nukes because we're very isolated. Kai and Chris in the pre-show, they made a more direct tie to Iran's nuclear ambitions. And be that as it may, I think, there's a good sea change. I guess we can say on the net scale of things, we could see a net benefit or a net positive of delaying disarmament in the alternate timeline. I'm just going to pause it right now and say that there might also be a net negative side on this. And that is that disarmament would be seen in the sense of, the outgoing government didn't end up doing this. They lost power, they lost influence, and now this kind of ascendant rising government, sure, they disarmed and got a lot of, economic benefit from it, and they gain a lot on the world stage. But they have these economic ties and they have this rising geopolitical influence, but they're not able to put their money where their mouth is as much anymore. They're not able to, back if there was some sort of big conflict that would erupt or, existential crisis against their nation state. They just have conventional arms. They have conventional measures and conventional means. So I think in the end, these hermit nations, these, pariah nations like North Korea and Iran. And when I was thinking through this, it's kind of chaotic to me because I would have thought that if South Korea or South Africa kept its nuclear weapons, all the way up to the modern era, we might have seen these other governments also want in on the nuclear club themselves. But I think as we've seen this episode pan out and we've seen the impacts of just a 5-year delay on disarmament, what that does for South Africa, I think in the end, unless, you guys disagree and want to jump in here on this, I still think that there is a motivation for these countries that don't want anything to do with the international order as it stands. I think they're more motivated and not less motivated to acquire nuclear weapons. But anyway, I'm just going to put that out there. What do you guys have to say about that?
I think when you take a look at the list of nations that are currently nuclear powers, there's no one standing out on that list that strikes me as someone as a nation that would be amicable to the idea of disarming because South Africa voluntarily disarmed. So I think the nuclear powers that are armed today would still be armed in our timeline, in the alternate timeline. Right. I mean, you have Russia, obviously, they're going to be nuclear armed till the US is nuclear armed, right? Never going away. US, same thing. China, France, UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, they're all nuclear armed. And so there's no reason for them to... South Africa disarming is not going to change their calculus, in my opinion. Its effects on proliferation as a whole, whether that list is expanded, that's an interesting question. I'm actually not sure if that list would be expanded as a result of South Africa disarming. It's hard for me to say, and my gut reaction is no. But in terms of the list shrinking, that's more definitive. I think the answer to that is definitely no.
Yeah. And I think, my initial reaction was like, well, if South Africa disarms, or if South Africa doesn't disarm, then proliferation expands. I
Agreed.
I happen to see, since we created in our timeline just a 5-year delay on disarmament, my gut was going to be, well, there's not going to be anybody else that disarms as a result of that. But I thought, hey, maybe this might cause other countries to not want to acquire nuclear weapons because they see what happens in South Africa. They see them gain more prominence and be like, hey, I want some of that too. The issue is that they don't get any of those benefits because South Africa uniquely gains them by having them and then letting them go.
I actually think it may be the opposite, in that I agree with you, by the way, that the big five, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, all face unique security circumstances that they do not want. They can't. But what you might see, because South Africa is a nation that achieved nuclear weapons and then traded them in for regional hegemony. Well, I'm Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I was trying to go with this.
Or if I'm going to say Brazil. If I'm an aspiring regional power, then maybe that is something that I'm interested in.
Turkey.
Now, Turkey's an interesting one.
I didn't think about that. Turkey might be one.
Turkey's very interesting because they want in on the European Union, which to me has always been geographically hilarious because they literally own one little tiny triangle in Europe and they're mostly in Asia. But anyway, be that as it may, geographical oddities aside, no, that's actually a fascinating thing to think through.
I think the issue with Turkey is this. First, it needs to make up its mind. What region is it a hegemon in? Because it ain't going to be Europe.
Not as much as they want in on the EU. Mm-mm.
But two things about Turkey. One, because it's a NATO member, it does not face the security situation that any of the other proliferation states does. Like North Korea legitimately thinks it might be at war and the regime's existence might be called into question. India and Pakistan as well. Israel, obviously. Turkey has other security guarantees, and that's why, Germany never got interested in that except for that one time that we don't talk about.
Before NATO.
Yeah, before NATO. And the other thing is, with the level of NATO security integration, how does Turkey do that secretly?
And moreover, I mean, in Turkey, or sorry, I should say Turkey.
Turkey, yeah.
We still call Turkey. Turkey actually still hosts U.S. nuclear missiles. So perhaps the incentive there is not so strong. Mm-hmm. I wasn't so much thinking about it in terms of deterrence or them having security threats from conventional. But I was thinking more in terms of like the Syrian conflict, these sorts of conflicts that have bubbled up. Might that be the catalyst for developing nuclear arms?
That was
and I know it's been thought about.
I mean, here's the thing as well, and we're getting kind of really up into the rabbit hole here, right at the very end of the episode. This is what we love to do on A Fork in Time. But I mean, we have the Syrian civil war, Syrian conflict. We have the Kurds, always being a problem for them. We have Iran wanting nuclear weapons, and before Saddam Hussein was taken out, there's this whole idea of, well, what if Saddam has, weapons of mass destruction, all these kind of things going on. Chris, I think this is the perfect point for you to end things off by bringing your yellow cakes. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm going to hold off on the yellow cake.
Okay.
I will tell it that this will be a closer.
Okay.
Here's the thing, though, which I think is really interesting and we haven't thought about. If South Africa is building itself up as a player in international affairs in the mid-90s, I think one of the real let me just jump to my point. Does Iraq fall? Is there an invasion of Iraq?
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Oh, jeez. Oh, Lord, have mercy. This is a two-parter. That's a two-parter right
That's
there.
a two-parter, maybe.
Is there just like the argument of, hey, listen, like looking at the Libyan example, and I know this also affects the calculus there of, when Evan was talking earlier about the decision of nations to be nuclear or not, what happened in Libya with Gaddafi stepping aside and saying, listen, I saw what happened before. I saw what you did in Iraq. Here's all of the paperwork on my weapons. I'm giving them up completely. That did not work out well for him, but this is a discussion that needs to be had or thought about. Maybe we just leave it for everyone in the comments section. I
Yeah,
think that's a really good idea. But
yeah.
this idea of, like, when you start talking about, well, what's going to happen in Kurdistan, what's going to happen in Syria, what's going to happen in all of these other places, I have to say, and by the way, what's going to happen with Iran's nuclear ambitions? What happens with Iraq? Because all of these things are changed by that question.
All the calculus is significantly changed, and I think we think of, and here, and I'll just speak for myself. As someone who grew up in the early 2000s and was a little kid, but I was also oddly aware of what was going on in the world for being a little kid at this point. Kai is just laughing his head off right now in the background. He knows what I'm saying with this. But like, I was growing up during the George W. Bush war in Iraq. So I, from firsthand knowledge, know from my little kid perspective, like the rationale for the war, what was going on, why we got in there, blah, blah, blah. We tend to forget I think it was 1991, right, when we had the first war with Kuwait.
That was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was August of 1990.
1990, yeah. So
and then the American
timeline,
buildup was basically January 91, February 91. That was when what we consider the Gulf War happened.
Yeah. So Saddam's calculus has also probably changed too, because you don't think so?
Well, which time frame Saddam?
Yeah, again, man, we are opening massive cans of worms here, but
because hey, this is one of those things that happens in those intervening 5 years. South Africa has nuclear weapons during the first Gulf War.
Right. Yeah.
Now there is something to be said for him looking at that and saying, "Hey guys, this is an interesting thought." Saddam wanted to be another Salad, or a Nasser, and him looking at what South Africa did and looking at them and saying, "Hey, listen, because of who they were fighting, they were able to develop these weapons and parlay that into a regional hegemony."
Yeah.
Well, look at me. Because of who I was fighting, Iran, got these weapons. What if I give them up? What will you give me? And that's a really interesting question because, again, the first Gulf War has already happened. As much as I agree with Kai's point of Mandela not necessarily being welcomed into the family of nations yet, man, Saddam's got a lot more to deal with.
Oh, Saddam's got a lot higher hills to climb over to get there. If he thinks that he'll be able to get the same response or reaction as a result of him giving up weapons, I think he gets Gaddafi'd more so than he gets Mandela.
And I think it's a
100%. Yeah.
And then what you might see is his successor. The policy of, we don't make those kind of deals with the weapon regime, but let us know when you've got a successor.
Yeah. I
Oh.
think, yeah, and that leaves some very fascinating implications moving forward, not just for having a stronger South Africa and South African Trade Union, SAFTA, Bantu Union, all that stuff. But man, we really did come up with some really interesting implications down the timeline, um, as a result of moving a disarmament by 5 years. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. Are there
Well, hold on.
any?
I
was gonna say,
promised everybody something.
yes,
I promised
you did.
everybody something.
Yes, do get into that now.
I feel ancient. In the pre-podcast, we were talking, and we talked a little bit about the kind of natural resources that a possible Southern African free trade area might have. And we're looking through it, and Evan mentioned, oh, apparently Niger has stores of uranium. And I said, well, yeah, yellow cake. Anybody that is I don't even want to say generation or age or something. When you hear uranium in Niger, you know what that means. That's the yellow cake. That's the yellow cake that they tried to say that Saddam was buying uranium from Niger to do his weapons program. Kai, no offense, but just because of how old you were, thought I said yellow cave. But it was just really weird to me that, like, I miss Dylan. I miss Dylan. I miss Robert and other
Robert
people.
Kochu.
Who, but like nobody who was like an adult in the early aughts does not know what yellow cake is. That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. So,
but you what do you mean yellow cake? What are you talking about? Who the words "who is Valerie playing" came out of Evan's mouth.
Yeah, and that's hard to believe, I'm sure, for most of our older listening audience. So there you go. And if you are of more of the Kai and Evan generation, well, look up yellow cakes and go down an interesting rabbit hole of history. I think the last thing I'm going to throw in here is, now that we've mentioned Niger and its uranium resources, I will just say that the geopolitical calculus for, like Western Africa, in modern geopolitics today, with like Mali and Niger, these countries that used to be like more pro-Western governments, and especially in light of, France that owned most of sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, that region of the hump, becoming independent. For a while, they were pretty pro-Western. And then in wake of, even before the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, a lot of these governments became more quote unquote non-aligned. And in actuality, like even in 2012, Russia would send troops to protect, what was going on in the conflicts in Mali. So they became very tied in with Russia.
Russia wouldn't send troops. Yevgeny Prigozhin would.
Yes. It's not official Russian troops. It's the Wagner group, which would be sent into a lot of these areas. So then as a result, they would become, more aligned with Russia. So there even today, really kind of more a couple of years ago, but even today, there's this concern of, well, what is, Niger going to do? Is it going to cut a deal and, help Russia evade sanctions and stuff and give them some of their resources? Well, in the alternate timeline, maybe these governments stay more Western aligned. Who knows? But anyway, dear listeners, if there's nothing else from the Chris Peanut Gallery or Kai, I think this is about as good a time as any to wrap things up. If you enjoyed this, let us know. Sound off in the comments, sound off on Discord. We would love to hear your thoughts on this very wide-ranging discussion. So, as we always like to end things off, if we happen to stumble across and encounter a fork in time, What do you think we should do with that?
Take it.
All right. I think we should take it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.